I'm Dave Casper, Managing Editor for Inclusive Magazine. Our guest today is Dr. Gerald Niznick, prosthodontist and innovator, a true pioneer in the field of dental implantology. Jerry, thanks for being here today.
Dave, thanks for having me. I'm always impressed when I visit Glidewell operations, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
We're fortunate that you made the trip. Now, you began in private practice as a prosthodontist in the late 60s and then started with dental implants in 1971. Tell us about that journey. What made you decide to get involved in implants?
Well, I opened a practice after getting a master's degree in prosthetics at Indiana University. I came into the San Fernando Valley, opened a dental office, and I was the only prosthodontist for 1,000 dentists, and everybody was sending me their denture patients, although I primarily wanted to do crown and bridge. And the denture patients, there was no good solution for a loose lower denture, no matter how good the impressions were. So I got involved with implants with the American Academy of Implant Dentistry in '71, and all through the '70s I placed the kind of implants that were available at that time, blade implants, subperiosteals, some screws. But by the end of the '70s I was somewhat disenchanted with the predictability and thought that there must be a better solution.
1971 seems like the Wild West in the field of implantology. What was it like with just one organization? And did you have to have your meetings in secret, or?
No, we were a very close-knit group of about 300 people and true pioneers in the field that have allowed us to get where we are today, all willing to share their information. But the knowledge was somewhat limited and it just didn't have the solutions that were needed for universities and specialists to really want to get involved.
And so you were doing primarily lower overdenture retention, those types of cases?
Well, no, with blade implants we're doing 3-unit bridges, subperiosteals, totally dentureless cases. Rather extensive surgery, but it really didn't solve the simple problem of stabilizing a lower denture. And by the end of the '70s, I started thinking of ways to solve that problem. I'd had a lot of success if I could just save 2 or 3 lower teeth, do root canals, cut the teeth down to improve the crown root ratio, and do a Dolder bar or a zest anchor or something. If I could just save 2 or 3 snaggly teeth, I could really stabilize that lower denture, and I thought there must be a way to do that with dental implants. And what came out of that was the 1980, the Corvent implant and the Corvent overdenture attachment.
You wrote a paper on that in 1982. It was the first time really someone published an article talking about using freestanding implants for overdenture attachment.
Yes, it was probably documented the first case probably ever done with freestanding implants. In order to do that, the implants had to become ankylosed. With the blade implants, sometimes they were firmly attached to bone, sometimes they had fibrous tissue around them, but they were held in by a 3-unit bridge connected to a natural tooth. When you're going to have freestanding implants, I had to develop the surgical protocols in order to achieve ankylosis, or what we today call osseointegration. And that's simply done by avoiding overheating when you're placing the implant, get good initial stability, and then leave the implant unloaded for a period of 3 or 4 months. And if I did all those things right, the implant would become ankylosed.
That same year, 1982, you also founded Corvent, and that was also the now famous Toronto Osseointegration Conference. Is that just purely coincidental, or how did those 3 things come together at the same time?
Well, it was very fortunate for me that they did. After I started with the Corvent, a friend of mine told me about Brånemark in Sweden. A friend of his had gone to Brånemark, Dan Sullivan as a matter of fact, a prosthodontist that had gone to Brånemark, and I went to the USC library and found a book on Brånemark, and I was very pleased to see that somebody had done long-term follow-up studies on implants that achieved ankylosis, and he was calling them osseointegration. Now, these studies didn't test different designs, didn't test different materials. All it showed was that if you could get an implant to osseointegrate and it stayed there for a year, it would probably stay there for 10 or 15 or 20 years at least, as long as they were following it. So I started lecturing on the Brånemark research in association to this ankylosed implant that I developed, the Corvent. And really what I attribute Corvent's commercial success to was marketing of the education. I trained thousands of dentists. I ran 2-day courses every week in my office. I traveled all over the world really lecturing, and I was marketing education. I wasn't marketing the implant, and it really brought Corvent, by 1990, was the largest implant company in the world.
You mentioned you're doing courses in your office, so you're still practicing prosthodontist at the time?
Yes, I was placing the implants, lecturing. I'd give a 2-day course. Had built a large surgical center with cameras, 26 dentists, and every Monday afternoon I'd place implants. Every Tuesday morning I'd uncover and lecture the rest of the time, and train thousands of dentists that way.
How long did you keep practicing before you finally had to focus on the business full time?
By 1986, I was pretty well done with that. I had a couple of associates who would line me up a patient, and I would walk in, just do that surgery for these courses. But by 1986, 87, I had stopped that. I was too busy. The company was growing, and I was traveling.
That's fantastic. That's a lot of work.
Yes.
Now, you can't talk about Corvent and not talk about the internal hex. And at first glance, you have well over 35 issued patents in the field of dental implantology. The one everyone talks about the most is the what was originally referred to as the internal hex. How did you come up with that idea? What impact has that had on the field?
Well, the Corvent implant was developed with just a hex hole that went down about 8 millimeters into the implant. And the idea was, from my experience, post and core, if I had a hole, I could put a variety of abutments in it. So I developed the hex hole to screw the implant in, and then a variety of abutments to cement in. If it was for an overdenture, stabilize an overdenture, it was the Corvent snap attachment. Very similar to the GPS internal connection that Implant Direct has today. If it was for crown and bridge, we could make straight titanium abutments, castable abutments, multi-unit bars. We had abutments that had screw receiving. So what the Corvent implant in 1982 brought to the field was versatile prosthetics, application-specific prosthetic components, whereas the Brånemark implant had one multi-unit abutment, didn't allow for angled abutments,
Right.
Didn't allow for aesthetics. Axel Kirsch should come up in Germany with the IMZ, again an implant that didn't allow for angled abutments. So the cemented abutment really opened up the field, but it had its shortcomings. And that was, it was not retrievable. Dentists would leave cement in there that could cause soft tissue problems. So in 1986, I had the idea of putting the internal threads below the hex. And making the hex a little bigger, of course, so you could get in and do the threads, and developing a 2-piece abutment so that you could do a transfer of that internal hex rotational position to a working cast so that you could fabricate the abutments indirectly. From my experience with crown and bridge, creating chamfer margins, I thought of creating a lead-in bevel to the internal hex for lateral stability, and I thought it would reduce the marginal gap. That has become the conical connection of today. Most companies make an implant, many of them with the exact dimensions compatible with the original 1986 screw vent. Zimmer, who bought Corvent ultimately in 2000, has their screw vent line. MIS, all the other Israeli ones. The inclusive implant by Glidewell was smart enough to copy that connection exactly. BioHorizons as well. So in almost every country you go to, there's somebody that has cloned that connection.
And there seems to be also a clinical benefit to an internal connection versus an external hex relative to screw loosening. Why is that?
Well, originally people said, well, an internal connection is just an external turned upside down. But that totally missed the point of the biomechanics of it. When you have an external hex implant, first of all, you can't make the hex very high because it would interfere with angled abutment. So the Bronnemark was 7/10 of a millimeter. You sit the abutment on that shoulder, not a bevel, but a butt joint shoulder, and then lateral forces cause the screw to flex because it's tipping off of the shoulder, and that led to screw loosening. When you went internal, the abutment hex was what was taking up the lateral load, not the screw. So the key was, if we could eliminate screw loosening by a better connection with the lead-in bevel and the internal connection, we could then do cemented restorations on these implants and get away from the screw-retained restorations with the access hole coming through the crown, maybe through the occlusal, maybe through the labial. So really, the internal connection made conventional implant prosthodontics possible.
How many companies would you say you licensed the internal hex to at the time?
Well, I think I sued over 10 companies. Some of them I just stopped them from making it. Some I licensed, Straumann, Calcitech, 3i, many others that just faded away under the face of that. And it's been very good to be associated with that development over the years, and with the development of the two-piece abutment that allowed for transfers for indirect fabrication of abutments and crowns.
Prior to that innovation, how were restorations fabricated indirectly without that transfer?
Well, there was a transfer component with the Bronnemark, with the external hex, that would transfer an analog of the external hex, but those were all for screw-retained abutments.
Standard abutments.
What they called the standard abutment. Nobody had the internal connection, so they didn't need the transfer. So one went hand in hand. And really, in developing the two-piece abutment, I developed the two-piece transfer. Well, not two-piece transfer, yes. Now I'm into a three-piece transfer, which I'll explain later.
Earlier you were talking about education, and one component of education is also research. And around the same time as the internal hex innovation, the FDA was considering changing the classification of dental implants to a Class 3 device, similar to a pharmaceutical, for example. And so all of the major implant companies at the time, and granted there weren't that many back then, were embarking on pretty aggressive studies, research and development type studies, to prepare for this pending change in classification. You took the biggest swing of all with the Veterans Administration study, which I think included 32 centers, 1,000 different patients. Why go after such a big bite? What was the objective there?
Well, I had to, because we had, at that point, 4 different implants. And the rumor was that you're going to have a different study for each quadrant of the mouth or for each application. So we had to devise a study that was all-inclusive. We'd put, say, a totally dentulous lower jaw, we would put the core vent, screw vent, and biovent implants. Biovent being a cylinder, screw vent being threaded, core vent being basket. In the maxilla, totally dentulous, we included the microvent, which was a push-in, screw-in, small diameter implant. Then we had to do partially dentulous in the posterior. So it got very expansive. It was a study that I had committed over $4 million to. The VA matched that.
Wow.
And fortunately, 1,000 veterans were treated with implants. And the results became published in 2 special issues, a special issue of the Oral Surgery Journal, then a special issue of the Perio Journal, documenting the success of implants and bone loss, whether it be diabetic or the experience level of the clinician. And what I think the biggest thing that came out of that was the understanding that bone loss associated with a screw implant or an endosseous implant is really related to how thick the labial plate was at the time you placed the implant. there was a direct correlation. We hear so much today about platform switching,
Right.
stops bone loss, or laser lock, or microthreads, or tighter fit in the abutment. But these were 1,000 implants that were placed and buried. And at the time they prepared the surgical socket, they measured the labial plate before they inserted the implant. Then when they uncovered the implant, before any abutment was attached, they would look at how much bone loss, record it, correlate it with how thick the labial plate was, and concluded that if you had a 2 millimeter labial plate, you weren't going to lose any bone. If you had a millimeter thickness, you'd lose about a millimeter. If it was a half millimeter, you might lose 2 before any abutment was ever attached to it.
With no reference to implant design at that point.
No reference to implant design, to platform switching, or to abutments, to anything other than the implant and the surfaces.
But a lot of the technology today, specifically platform switching, certainly has been documented to assist in the reduction of crestal bone loss. And is that, in your opinion, relative to thinner labial plates?
Well, I think it's relative to articles that are not being well understood. If you look at Implant Direct's website on our library, you'll find 2 articles that showed no difference in bone loss with platform switching or without platform switching. Same thing goes for an article on laser lines. So the problem with deciphering all this is who's paying the researcher and what is his objective. I've written a number of articles which are posted in the controversy section of Implant Direct's website, analyzing these research projects and how they specifically left out certain factors so they could reach the conclusion they want. So keep it simple, stupid, drill the hole, have adequate bone, don't overheat the site, use a strong enough implant, don't overload the implant, get good initial stability, and you're going to be successful with implants.
Back to the study for a second. You mentioned there was a lot of data recorded and certainly some ancillary learnings coming out of the evaluation of that data. What about implant surface? What were the surface technologies like at the time, and were any conclusions able to be made from the study?
Yes. Initially, the core vent, like orthopedic hips, I made it blasted with aluminous oxide, and then you treat it with an acid wash to get the aluminous oxide particles out. It's called passivating procedure. Similar to the SLA surface of Straumann, luminous oxide. The problem with using aluminous oxide is you need to use acid to get it off, and that blasting etching process rounds the threads and the cutting edge of the self-tapping grooves.
So it becomes smoother.
It becomes smoother, just like Astra used titanium oxide. So by 1986, because competitors such as Nobel, who were selling machine surfaces, which today are not popular at all because they're too smooth, but they were promoting the machine surface, they start looking at our surface with aluminous oxide and found aluminum oxide particles still remaining. So I went to a hydrofluoric acid etched surface in 1986, which creates micro pits, works nicely on pure titanium, but on alloy, which is too hard, it really ended up with too smooth a surface. So when we got the VA results, which were all either HA-coated implants, which is a nice textured surface, or acid etched, we saw that the acid etched smooth surfaces had a higher failure rate. And by 1990 and 91, I had switched to blasting the implants with hydroxyl apatite crystals, a process that I called SBM, soluble blast media. It's the same as RBM or MTX or blasting with these surfaces that can be dissolved away. So you end up with a medium texture surface without any contamination and still retain the sharpness of the threads. And that is what we've used, the same surface, the same company doing this treatment since 1990.
You mentioned earlier you sold your company in 2001 to what is now Zimmer.
Yes.
What made you decide to get back into the implant game in 2006, I believe, with the launch of Implant Direct?
Well, I leased Zimmer. It was called Calcitech then it changed to Center Pulse, then it was acquired by Zimmer. I leased my factory in Calabasas, 40,000 square foot factory that I built for making implants, to them as part of the transaction, but that lease expired in October of 2004, and they informed me in early 2004 that they were not going to be renewing the lease. They were building their own manufacturing in Carlsbad near the Calcitech facilities. So I was going to be left with an empty building and about 100 employees that weren't going to move to Carlsbad that really knew how to make implants. Now, I was under a 5-year non-compete, but that did not restrict me from preparing to compete. So by May, June of 2004, I opened an office across the street from my old factory, started interviewing employees, buying equipment, and when they moved out the next day, I dropped 12 machines on the floor, and we spent the next 2.5 years developing a clean sheet implant system with supporting 80 or 90 employees for 2.5 years without selling any products.
But did the world really need another dental implant company in 2006?
Well, based on how fast Implant Direct has grown to over $100 million in sales, apparently it did. And there was a niche that I identified. There were the premium priced companies, and they just kept raising their prices every year without really changing the product or bringing more benefits to their customers. And then there were the discounters, primarily the Israeli companies and Brazilian and some companies in the States that were selling a $99 implant. Now, the discounters did not have the capital to build broad implant systems. They didn't have the knowledge to be innovators. So I saw a niche between the discounter and the premium price and basically created what I called the value segment of the market. Broad product lines, all-in-one packaging, compatibility, emphasis on internet education and ordering and customer service, and launched Implant Direct in October of 2006, and it's been a straight up shot from there. And now what you have is a lot of the premium companies buying lower priced divisions. Straumann bought a company in Brazil, Neodent. Nobel bought the Israeli Alpha Bio. So I think Straumann also bought a piece of a Korean company. So the big companies have been feeling the squeeze of what I created. And we're still in the midsection of a value player because I've continued to innovate products and stay ahead of the curve.
And at the time, there was also, I believe, the first true internet company in the dental implant space. How did that change your business model?
Well, the world was flat with the internet, and I figured that I could market against the big companies. I wasn't going to be providing the level of education I did with the Corvent or with what Nobel or Straumann were doing. I was going after...
And you didn't have any sales reps to start either.
We didn't have any sales reps. We had a very effective web design team, a lot of 3D graphics, technical support, and customer service, data miners, and we went after the low-hanging fruit. You want to take a course? Take it from Nobel. Then come and buy from us. We have a compatible implant. Same thing with Straumann and Zimmer. And we grew very nicely and gained a critical mass where the income was flowing into the company. But I realized that if I really wanted to be a major player, I needed outside sales force to go after converting the specialists. The specialists felt they needed the hand-holding of a salesperson, so we started building an outside sales force, and today Implant Direct has 70 or 80 outside salespeople, plus about 70 or 80 inside tech support and customer service people.
Now, Implant Direct started with the first system was the Spectra system.
Yes.
And it seems like that's a continuation from the origin of Corvent, which was, as you mentioned, application-specific abutments, and the Spectra system seems to be application-specific implants. Is that also a coincidence or just an evolution in your mind?
Well, that was exactly my strategy. If I can give a dentist 5 or 6 different implants, all with exactly the same body, but with different platforms for different applications. A 2-stage bone level, a 1-stage tissue level implant, a 1-piece with a snappy cemented abutment head, a 1-piece with a multi-unit abutment, the screw indirect implant, which I received a patent on. And then we came up with the Go Direct 1-piece with an overdenture attachment. I thought that would dramatically simplify it. One surgical protocol, application-specific implants. If you know what your application is, buy the implant for that. And that was what we launched to begin with. Quickly, I realized that there was an opportunity if I could make an implant with a Nobel trilobe interface to go after that segment of the market and all the abutments that we could sell for that implant for Nobels. Nobel had a patent on the trilobe. I figured out a way around that patent by putting one trilobe group below the other. I circumvented their patent, but yet looking from the top, they look exactly the same and they're interchangeable. So the trilobe, the replace system came about. When the internal hex patent that I had sold to Zimmer expired in October 2007, I launched the Legacy line of implants with the lead-in bevel internal hex. The Legacy has expanded from Legacy 1, 2, 3, now Legacy 4, which is our most popular implant series. And then just so Straumann wouldn't feel left out, I made the Swish implant, Swish Plant, and the Swish Plus, and we're coming out with the bone level Swish Plus 2 implant as well. So we started out with application-specific implants, went to a variety of other compatible ones, but always maintaining the concept of all-in-one packaging. Something that Glidewell's inclusive implant has taken to the next level with transfer components and temporization and whatever else you have in that box of yours. So because of all-in-one packaging, providing the implant on a fixture mount that is multifunctional as a transfer, as an abutment, modified as an abutment, including I got a patent on a cover screw and extender that I include with the implants that serves as a healing collar. So you can either use it or not use it. And putting all this together really allowed us to compare the prices and come up at 70% less than the major competitors were charging if you bought all those components. What's happened is the major companies have started to become discounters. And we posted on our website National Discount Registry, where you could look up and see what the discounts were that Nobel and Straumann and Zimmer and BioHorizons were doing in your area by zip code. We never discounted. We have one price. Buy 1,000 implants, buy one. And the reason for that is I think it's unfair to the general dentist who maybe does 30, 40, 50 implants a year to have to support the purchase price of a specialist doing 500 or 1,000 implants.
Interesting.
And we do not encourage you to buy big inventories. Buy what you need because the price will be the same whether it's 1 or 100 implants.
It's a good strategy.
It worked.
Yeah, clearly. You've never been one to shy away from controversy in all the years we've known each other. So let's talk about a couple of current controversial or sometimes controversial topics, and let's start with guided surgery. What's your opinion of guided surgery in the implant space?
Well, I don't think guided surgery is controversial. I think it's here. I think, back in the 80s, I'd lay a flap and figure out what I'm going to do and move the bone around and put in, 6 implants. But when I saw people being able to place 6 implants through a surgical guide in a half hour. I said, wow, if I was doing surgery, that's what I'd want to do. Plan it out and, work the plan and then plan the work and then work the plan, as Scott Gans says. I think it may be overused from the standpoint of single tooth implant placements. I certainly think that doing a CT scan, whether you're going to use a guide or not, is certainly an advantage for planning out what diameter and length implant you have, and that may eventually become the minimum standard of care as the price of CT machines start to drop. But I think that it's been a great asset to the implant industry.
You mentioned the price of CT scans dropping. Do you think the non-use of guides in in single implant indications, is that price specific? Is it because it adds so many more layers of cost for just a single implant?
Well, I think it depends on the confidence of the operator. I mean, if you can, and I'm not a big fan of flapless implant surgery.
Interesting.
Because one, you dramatically increase your risk of wiping out the labial plate if you're not in the right position. If you're going to do flapless surgery, then for sure I think you should use guided surgery, even if it's a single tooth. But if you lay a flap and you look at what the bone is, you can decide, do I want to flatten it? What diameter do I need? Of course, if you want to keep a minimal inventory, you make those decisions using a CT guide. But I think it depends on the operator's confidence, skill level, and experience. I used to use a periapical x-ray with a grid on it, and I would hold that up and see where the length was. I'd feel what the width of the bone is. I'd lay a flap, and originally the Corvent only came in one diameter, 6.3. And then we made 4.3 and 5.3. Today we have diameters from 3.2 up to 7. So
also one length, from what I understand. And didn't you have to cut the implant?
Yes, we made it. I couldn't figure out why would any dentist want to buy an inventory of implants. So the implant was 16 millimeters long with different score lines and an instruction. If you want a 13 millimeter implant, you cut 3 off the top. If you wanted a 10.5, you cut 2 off the top and 1 row of vents off the bottom. Eventually, I went to different lengths as my finances allowed me to expand the inventories. I bootstrapped that company and never had a partner, never borrowed any money, and based it on sales. But in the early days, I'll just tell you, I gave a course in New York. I had 200 registered and 150 walk-ins. Same thing in Baltimore. Today, the implant manufacturers are spending a tremendous amount of money to get a doctor into the lecture room.
Right.
They're paying opinion leaders to get up on podiums and tout their products. But it was wild in the mid-'80s of the dentists that really wanted a cost-effective implant. Now, the nice thing was that Nobel was selling for $20,000, and ours comparable products were amount was $4,300. So I ran an ad that says there is a difference between Implant Direct. It wasn't Implant Direct. A difference between the screw vent and the Bronnemark implant. One of the differences is cost. For $20,000, you can buy a Nobel system with 20 implant surgical drills. For $20,000, you can buy the same 20 implant surgical instruments, a Volvo 240DL a car, and a return flight to Gothenburg. And that was the first really competitive ad in dentistry. It ran for about 6 months and created a lot of controversy, established my reputation, I guess, for controversy.
But it had to start somewhere.
Yeah, it made the point, and because of Corvent, a lot of general dentists that want to get into implants that couldn't take the Bronnemark training programs were allowed to do it. A lot of the specialists that didn't want to spend the $1,500 for Nobel courses and pay for their implants. And I really have to say that the Nobel system added credibility to the field and I and the other implant manufacturers have benefited from that. Unfortunately, they were too slow to change. They kept using pure titanium, which is a weak material, machine surface, which is too smooth. And it's only now that they've launched the the Nobel Active implant, which has a lead-in bevel internal hex. Now that the screw vent patent has expired, all of a sudden they've discovered the lead-in bevel internal connection. But not to be outdone, I developed the interactive implant, which is prosthetically and surgically compatible.
To put the finishing touch on the guided surgery conversation,
Yes.
one of the side benefits of doing guided surgery is the ability for early or sometimes even immediate provisionalization. So if you look at that categorically, what's your opinion on immediate loading, immediate provisionalization?
Well, originally we thought you had to bury the implant and leave it unloaded for 3 or 4 months. But studies started to come out that if you were splinting implants together, even 2 in the posterior, or especially if it was across the midline of the arch, you could load, at least temporize if it's in the posterior. If it's across the arch, load it immediately, teeth in a day type of things, which I dramatically disagree with the concept of putting 4 implants in and tipping the 2 distal ones, when you could put 5 or 6 implants into that same space. Immediate load has now been proven to be successful if you get enough initial stability. And the litmus test is 30 Newton centimeters of torque to screw the implant in. 40 would be better. And this goes along with an article that I had written in 2000, The Search for Improved Results. And what I had done in 99 was develop a tapered screw vent, but to be inserted with straight step drills. And the idea was that you would titrate the size of the socket based on the quality of bone. You would stop at an intermediate drill if the bone was soft, screw in a self-tapping implant, compress the bone, which has been shown to increase percentage of bone contact, and get that high level of stability even in soft bone. I think that was taken too far with the Nobel Active, which flares too much and it can get jammed in to the socket, and then you need a cutting groove going in reverse to unscrew it. But the idea of a tapered implant going into a socket prepared with straight drills allows the dentist to always get the right amount of initial stability to allow for immediate loading, even in single teeth. I say always, that may be a stretch, but if he does the procedure right, he will achieve high initial stability even in soft bone.
Mm-hmm. The tapered implant, though, today has to be universal. Everybody has one, everybody sells one, everybody uses them.
Yes.
Even here in the laboratory, we see very few implant cases coming in where it's an older, traditional, straight-wall dental implant. So why is that? Just, it's universally better?
No, it was a misconception. Originally, Stereos came up with the tapered implant, the Replace, I think they called it. And the idea was that because it's tapered, you would avoid perforations on the labial or lingual wall. I don't think that's a serious concern. But what I saw the advantage of the tapered implant was that you could make a socket that was undersized, still get this tapered implant in and screw it in, and as you screw it in, it increases in stability. If the bone was dense, you make the socket bigger, and if the bone is very dense, you have a crestal bone drill that opens the socket up to exactly the same size. So Implant Direct never did make bone taps, because if you have a tapered implant or a straight implant and your final drill is a bone tap, you've made a loose fit for it. So I think the advantage that people are recognizing is improved initial stability by using the proper final sizing drill. A company called MIS gives you a final sizing drill packaged with every implant. I think that's not a benefit because you don't know what the final drill is going to be. It depends on the bone. So it's certainly been a lot of advances, I think, and still some to come.
Well, as we sit here today, you're, let's say, 6 months post-retirement. You
Yes.
decided to leave the business at the end of 2013. What would you say is your final or most significant innovation right before you left the business?
Thank you for that question. The last innovation, and it's patent pending now, is a 3-piece fixture mount. There's always a controversy whether you do an open tray impression, that means a hole in the top of a tray, you take the impression, then you undo the screw and pull the transfer out with the impression. It's kind of a nuisance compared to a closed tray where you just take the impression, pull it off, take the transfer off and put it into the impression. But there's a controversy as to what was more accurate. The Legacy 3 implant, I developed a fixture mount that you could cut off and there was an abutment left, but you had to go through that process of cutting it off and it was still a closed tray transfer. So the 3-piece transfer that I developed that is available on the Legacy 4 implant and on the interactive implant has the square that you use to screw the implant in snapped into the top of the fixture mount. When you pull the transfer impression, that transfers in to the impression material. Then you have the abutment, which is now we're able to make it longer and you don't have to cut it off to get the straight abutment. You can either leave that abutment in the implant and use it for temporary, or you could take it out and put it into an implant analog and pop it into the impression. If you choose to leave it in the implant, then we have abutment analogs. So you put the abutment analog in the impression and you have like a snappy abutment, an abutment level transfer. So I think providing that straight abutment with the most accurate metal to metal contact transfer is probably the last good idea I'm going to have.
I find that hard to believe. Thanks for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, good to see you.